Hey there, it's Chris from Good Roads, and I am documenting the process of taking my love for building boards from a hobby to a kind of small business where I can do production runs and make boards to get under feet of people like you. In the last couple videos, I 3D printed a mold and used it to press a couple blanks, and they came out really good. And that means that the next step of the process is cutting those blanks into something skateboard shaped. Now, as a hobbyist, it's really easy to make a paper template and shape your board that way, but if you're trying to make a lot of the same board, it can be really helpful to come up with a way to make that repeated work easier. So that's what I'm going to be taking a stab at today. I'm going to be making a router template so that I can shape the same deck over and over again precisely and without too much effort. Let's get into it. One of the things I'd like to do in this board making journey is to try to keep my board designs digital. Doing so will make it really easy to update them and improve them over time as I get feedback from the community. I've already got my mold geometry in a digital format, so for the shape, I figured I'd go that route too. And here's my first stab at a solution. A segmented 3D printable router template for the board shape that I'll be building. And design-wise, it's just a shell cut out from the male side of my printed mold. I hollowed it out in hopes of reducing the print time and the amount of plastic used. It's got the same bolt hole alignment as the mold, so I should get really accurate shapes. And I included these little tabs so that I can screw it into a backing board. So let's put it together. The first thing I need to do is feed these bolts through the template and glue them in place. They'll be used later to lock the blank into place and keep everything aligned as I'm routing. Next, I'm going to rough cut my backing board. I traced the template onto some plywood and took it over to the bandsaw. I cut fairly close to the line, but I made sure to leave myself some wiggle room that I'll clean up later. Next, I assembled the template on the backing board. I used CA glue and wood screws to hold everything down. I drove the screws by hand because I wanted to be gentle and not crack my printed parts. Yarr. The next step is to remove that excess plywood I left myself, and the original plan was to use a top-bearing flush cut bit with my router and take it right to the line, but it turns out I don't have one. All my flush cut bits are bottom bearing. So I brought it over to the belt sander and carefully brought the plywood in until I was flush with the printed parts. Not the most efficient way to do it, but by going slow and being careful, I think I got a pretty good result. A little bit of hand sanding to make the edges nice to handle, and the template is done. Now, some shapers out there go straight to cutting their blanks with the router tables, but I am not feeling brave enough to give that a shot yet. So I traced my template onto my blank and took it over the bandsaw to get it rough cut. Once that was done, I locked the blank in place on the template with these wing nuts and brought it over to my router station. I put this combo router table together in a previous video, but I've made some upgrades, so let me tell you what's new. First up, I replaced that janky old router with this nice new one, and oh my god, it is so much nicer to use and way less scary. And that old router is now living its best life as a set of DIY trucks, so I think this was a win all around. Another safety improvement that I added is this big honkin' shutoff switch. With this, I can turn the router on and off without having to crawl under the table, and more importantly, if something were to happen and I were injured or caught in the machine, I've got a big fat target to shut everything down. I even located it so that I can hit it with my knee if I need to, and all that makes me feel so much safer using this setup. I also added a couple lines for myself. I put a "do not put your hands inside this circle down, and I also drew some arrows to help me remember which way the bits are spinning, because I keep forgetting that. With all that in place, I hook my shop vac up to the cowl dust collector and get shaping. And that works pretty dang good. With a blank cut to shape, it's time to round the rails, so it's over to my other 3D printed tool, the Bishop Edge Rounding Guide. You can totally DIY a jig like this. DIY jigs are what inspired this tool, but if you'd like to grab them for yourself, they're available as print files and finished products over at goodroadscollective.com. And with that, the blank is done and ready for sanding. The rails look a little rough around the edges. I'm still getting my chops up with the Bishop, but all that means is that I'll have to spend a little extra time at the sanding drum. This is actually a really, really good starting place for the final steps of building a board. Well, how do I feel about all this? To begin with, the updates to the router station are night and day. It is so much more pleasant to use, and I feel so much safer using it. It's gone from something that feels like a janky setup that might get the job done to something that's more of a reliable tool that I'll be able to use over and over again in the shop without having to worry about losing fingers. And it also follows a template just great, so I'm loving how that's working. The template itself, though, I'm not so sure. I'm thinking this might not be it. It was a little bit too much of a hassle to assemble for my tastes, and actually mounting it to the backing board made certain parts of the template just a little too tall for my router setup. Which meant I had to go finish up those sections of the board by hand over at the belt sander, which is fine for one board at a time, but it's not gonna help me as I'm trying to make multiples. So I think I'm going to come up with something a little different for the final run, but in the meantime, I've got my prototype deck here, shaped, rounded, and ready for the final woodworking step in the process, which is sanding. So that's the piece of the process puzzle that we're gonna tackle next. If you'd like to see that and more awesome DIY board sport stuff, just go ahead and subscribe. As always, huge shout out to my supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to chip in and help me make these videos, there's a link down below. If you got questions or comments, you know where to leave them. I'll talk with you. And you know, as always, until next time, I love having you along for the ride, and I'll see you soon. Hey, quick note while we're wrapping things up. I'm gonna be at Maker Faire Rochester on November 20th in Rochester, New York. If you're in the area, swing on by. I'll have my molds, my decks, 3D printed tools, and we can chat about board building or printing or making in general, see all the awesome projects that people will have. So it should be a really fun time. If you're around, I hope to see you there. Yeah, buddy. Came out pretty good, pretty good. I'm getting better at this.